Imagine waking up one morning to find that the sky has turned a permanent shade of apocalypse gray. The sun's gone AWOL, and every breath tastes faintly like volcanic barbecue. Welcome to 74,000 years ago, when Mount Toba in Indonesia decided it was time for the most over-the-top mic drop in volcanic history. This wasn't just your average, oops, there's some ash in the air kind of eruption. No. Toba coughed up so much molten rock and gas that it basically hit the Earth's climate control with a hammer. Temperatures dropped, plants died, animals followed, and humans, well, we were basically just hairier, more confused versions of ourselves trying not to starve to death. Scientists think this little disaster may have whittled our entire global population down to a few thousand survivors. Yep, your family tree almost didn't exist because some mountain decided to cosplay as the end of the world. And the best part? We had no warning systems, no weather apps, and no way to just move somewhere else. So yeah, if you think your Monday was bad, try surviving a volcanic winter with nothing but rocks and teamwork. When you ask historians, paleontologists, or anyone with a mild interest in ancient disasters what the worst time to be alive was, you're going to get a buffet of terrible options. It's like asking a restaurant which dish is most likely to give you food poisoning. You're spoiled for choice. Ice ages? Brutal. Plagues? Horrific. Mass extinctions? Absolutely not a good look for any species involved. But for our purposes, we're talking about humans, which already narrows the field a bit, because dinosaurs might have had their bad days, but we weren't around to care. So let's break down the short list. You've got the Younger Dryas, about 12,900 years ago, when the planet decided, you know what? Let's slam the brakes on this warming trend and throw humanity back into freezer mode. Then there's the Black Death in the 14th century, which killed roughly a third of Europe's population and basically invented the concept of WFH. But instead of work from home, it was wait for hearse. Oh, and the late Bronze Age collapse, where every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean seemed to implode simultaneously. But here's the thing. In all of those eras, there were still thriving pockets of humanity, trade, and some semblance of technology. Now, let's hop in our imaginary time machine and roll the clock back much further, to a time when thriving meant we have fire and maybe a sharp rock. We're talking roughly 74,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens were not the globe-dominating, skyscraper-building species we are now. Instead, we were a few scattered groups across Africa, parts of Asia, and maybe just poking our noses into new territories. And then came the event that nearly erased us from the evolutionary guest list, the Toba super eruption. This wasn't just an inconvenience like, oh, the crops failed this year, or it's colder than usual. This was the Earth throwing a tantrum so big it registered in ice cores from the opposite side of the planet. Imagine an explosion so massive it made Mount St. Helens look like someone lit a birthday candle. The amount of volcanic material blasted into the atmosphere was on the scale of thousands of cubic kilometers. That's not hyperbole. Scientists estimate around 2,800 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and debris were launched skyward. That's enough to bury an entire country under a thick layer of, welp, we're doomed. And here's the worst part. Humans back then were just starting to figure out this whole not dying instantly thing. Fire? Great, but you still need something to cook. Hunting? Fantastic, except all the animals are either dead or migrating to somewhere less apocalyptic. Farming? Ha! Not even invented yet. Choosing the Toba eruption as the worst time to be a human isn't just about the sheer scale of destruction. It's about the timing. It hit when we were fragile, small in number, and extremely dependent on specific ecosystems. You wipe out those ecosystems, and suddenly survival becomes a game of hope you find something edible before the cold or the ash gets you. So yes, we could argue about other bad eras. The ice sheets of the Pleistocene weren't exactly spa resorts, and the Younger Dryas was a meteorological sucker punch. But if you want to talk about an event that nearly hit the reset button on our species, Toba wins the crown. It was the prehistoric equivalent of a global Control-Alt-Delete, and somehow, against the odds, a few thousand of us stubbornly refused to go extinct. And we're about to dive headfirst into that nightmare. So let's talk about Toba. the Indonesian volcano that decided to audition for the role of most overdramatic geological event in human history. Picture this. Somewhere on the island of Sumatra, a giant magma chamber had been quietly stewing for thousands of years, building up pressure like a tea kettle from hell. And then, around 74,000 years ago, it just lost its temper. When Toba erupted, it wasn't a polite puff of smoke. It was an earth-shattering, continent-shaking, atmosphere-altering cataclysm. We're talking about an explosion estimated to be 5,000 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens in 1980. That's not me exaggerating for dramatic effect. That's the math. In a single event, it ejected roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of volcanic material into the sky. If that number means nothing to you, imagine taking every drop of water in Lake Tahoe, turning it into molten rock and ash, and then dumping it straight into the upper atmosphere. The immediate area? Gone. Obliterated. Anyone or anything within 1,000 kilometers was basically erased from existence. But the real nightmare was what came next. The ash cloud. This wasn't some local dust storm you could brush off your shoulders. This ash blanket spread over much of South Asia, parts of Africa, and the Indian Ocean. Some layers found in India are meters thick, and scientists have traced microscopic ash particles as far as Greenland's ice cores. Yep, Toba sneezed in Sumatra, and the Arctic caught a cold. Now here's where it gets even worse. All that ash and sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere formed a reflective layer that bounced sunlight back into space. Temperatures dropped like a rock, in some regions by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. Crops didn't exist yet, but if they had, they'd be gone. Plants, dead or struggling to grow in low light. Animals, either froze, starved, or migrated away from the disaster zone. And humans? Well, we were standing around with stone tools, trying to figure out why our favorite hunting grounds now looked like Mordor. And don't think this was just a few weeks of bad weather. We're talking years of volcanic winter, with some models suggesting decades of lingering climate disruption. Imagine endless overcast skies, freezing nights in places that were normally warm, and a constant layer of gritty ash coating everything you touch. If you've ever gotten dust in your eyes on a windy day, multiply that irritation by, I can't breathe properly, and also I might starve, and you're getting close. The archaeological record backs this up. Sites in southern Africa show changes in stone tool production around this time, suggesting our ancestors had to adapt fast, probably switching hunting strategies or focusing on whatever edible plants and shellfish they could find. In India, some sites are buried under thick layers of toba ash, hinting that entire human communities were wiped off the map. And here's the kicker. This wasn't just a local crisis. The eruption may have triggered what's known as a genetic bottleneck in humans. Studies suggest that, in the aftermath, the global Homo sapiens population may have crashed to as few as several thousand breeding individuals. Think about that. Your entire species reduced to a population smaller than a modern-day high school football stadium. Now, scientists debate exactly how severe the bottleneck was, but even the conservative estimates paint a grim picture. Whether you were in Africa, Asia, or anywhere in between, the effects were inescapable. You'd be cold, hungry, and breathing in ash for years, assuming you weren't already dead from the blast itself. So yeah, Toba didn't just erupt. It rewrote the rules of survival for the entire human species. And the fact that we made it through it all is nothing short of ridiculous. We're the descendants of a handful of stubborn, ash-covered survivors who decided extinction wasn't on their to-do list. So picture yourself as a Homo sapiens right after Toba's little temper tantrum. You wake up in your hidey hole, or under your rock shelter, and the sky is still a depressing shade of don't bother. The air tastes like you're licking the inside of a fireplace, the plants are dying, and every animal that isn't already dead is heading in the opposite direction of where you are. You have no idea why the world suddenly feels like the set of a post-apocalyptic movie. Because, surprise, you don't even know what a world is yet. And yet, somehow, we didn't die out. Which is honestly the biggest plot twist in human history. The going theory is that we survived by clustering into smaller, more adaptable groups. Forget massive hunting parties or big sprawling communities. This was survival in the most stripped-down, minimalistic sense. Small bands meant fewer mouths to feed, easier mobility, and less competition for the scraps of food still available. But small also meant vulnerable. One bad hunt, one illness, and poof, the group's gone. Food was the number one problem. The big game animals people relied on, gone or migrating far out of range. Plant foods, mostly dead or buried under ash, which left two main options: scavenging and exploiting whatever stable food sources were left. Archaeological evidence from coastal sites in southern Africa shows a shift in diet during this period. People started eating more shellfish and marine resources. The ocean, after all, doesn't care if the sky is dark and the land is barren. Shellfish, seaweed, and fish became lifelines, providing steady protein and calories when inland resources vanished. But not everyone had the luxury of a coastline. Inland groups probably relied on a mix of surviving small game, hardy plants, and sheer desperation. In times like this, you'd eat things you'd normally ignore: roots, insects, whatever small animals you could trap. Fire became even more important, not just for warmth in the colder climate, but for making otherwise inedible foods safe and palatable. And here's the thing: surviving wasn't just about food. It was about keeping your group alive long enough to reproduce. This is where the so-called genetic bottleneck comes into play. When populations get that small, every birth counts. People had to stick together and cooperate in ways that went beyond just sharing dinner. Knowledge of hunting spots, edible plants, and shelter locations had to be passed on, because losing one skilled forager or hunter could mean the difference between life and death. There's some fascinating evidence from sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa that shows humans were already starting to think in more complex ways during this period, making more advanced stone tools, planning hunts around the tides, even processing pigments, possibly for symbolic or cultural purposes. That suggests that despite the nightmare environment, our ancestors didn't just curl up and wait to die. They innovated. And they had to be tough. Volcanic winters don't just make it colder, they make it weirder. Weather patterns shift, rainfall changes, the animals you depend on disappear. You can't trust the seasons anymore. One year, a certain plant might grow in abundance. The next, nothing. That kind of unpredictability forces you to get creative fast, or you're gone. Think about how absurd this is. Somewhere, maybe on a windswept beach in Africa, a small group of humans was roasting shellfish over a fire, looking at the dim, ash-choked sky, and still finding the motivation to live another day. They didn't know they were the last hope for an entire species. They weren't heroes in the way we tell stories now. They were just stubborn animals who refused to give up. And because of that stubbornness, and maybe a bit of luck, every single person alive today can trace their ancestry back to those survivors. So yeah, next time someone says, "My ancestors were tough," remember, yours lived through a global volcanic winter with no shelter, no agriculture, and no idea when, or if, the sun would come back. And they won. Alright, so we've given Toba the crown for worst time to be a human. But let's be fair. History is basically a greatest hits album of terrible moments. If you were a time traveler and your machine broke down in any of the following eras, you'd still be pretty much toast. First up, the Younger Dryas, about 12,900 years ago. Picture this. Humanity had just been enjoying a nice warm interglacial period after the last ice age. Things were finally looking up. Plants were growing, game was returning, people were starting to experiment with farming. And then nature slammed on the brakes and threw it into reverse. Overnight, climate conditions swung back to ice age levels. Crops, for those just learning to plant them, failed. Big game animals migrated away or died, and the planet went into a deep chill for about 1,200 years. The exact cause is still debated. Some blame massive meltwater flooding from retreating glaciers. Others point to a possible comet impact. Whatever it was, it reminded early agricultural societies that the climate can and will pull a U-turn without warning. Then there's the late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE. This one's got everything: famine, war, economic collapse, mass migration, and what can only be described as the ancient version of supply chain issues. Across the Eastern Mediterranean, great powers like Egypt, the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans were thriving. And then, over just a few decades, they all crumbled. Written records from the time mention mysterious invaders called the Sea Peoples, droughts that killed crops, and cities burning. This was bad news for anyone living in a civilized society. because once the infrastructure was gone, life expectancy plummeted, and survival meant going back to small, isolated communities. We can't skip the Black Death, 1347 to 1351 CE, even if it's far from prehistoric. This bubonic plague pandemic wiped out an estimated one-third to one-half of Europe's population in just a few years. Entire villages vanished. Trade stopped. The smell of death was everywhere, and superstition ran wild. The psychological toll alone was enormous. People stopped trusting their neighbors, believing anyone could be a carrier. And unlike Toba, where humanity's population bottleneck happened over years and involved slow starvation, the Black Death was like a blitzkrieg of misery. You could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening. Not ideal. If we want to get really bleak, there's also the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which infected a third of the global population and killed tens of millions. But in terms of sheer existential threat to the species, pandemics like this don't quite rival volcanic winters. They're horrific, but they leave a lot of the environment intact, so there's still food, water, and sunlight. And for a truly deep cut, let's throw in the coldest period of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, known as the last glacial maximum. Glaciers covered huge swaths of North America, Europe, and Asia. Sea levels were about 120 meters lower, which sounds cool until you realize it meant much less temperate coastline to live on. If you were a human in Northern Europe back then, you were either moving south or becoming a human popsicle. Still, while all of these contenders were varying shades of awful, they have one thing in common. Humanity always had somewhere to go. During the Younger Dryas, you could migrate south. During the Late Bronze Age collapse, you could flee the cities for rural areas. Even in the Black Death, some villages and regions were relatively untouched. Toba was different. When it went off, the effects were global. You couldn't just pack up your things and say, "We'll ride this out over there." Over there was also covered in ash and freezing. That's why it stands out. It didn't just hit a region, it hit the whole planet. No matter where you were playing the same miserable survival game. And given that there might have been fewer than 10,000 of us left, losing just a couple more groups could have meant the end. So yes, other disasters were bad. Really bad. But Toba? Toba was the event where we almost didn't make it. And honestly, it's probably the reason your great times a million grandparents were some of the most resilient humans to ever live. When the sky finally began to clear after the Toba eruption, the world must have looked alien. The ash was still there, layered over the land like a suffocating gray blanket. Rivers were clogged, forests had burned or withered, and for the scattered bands of surviving humans, the volcanic winter had rewritten the rules of existence. The old ways of living, the hunting routes, the seasonal migrations, the food sources, were gone. Everything had to be relearned. The first challenge was simply finding food again. With the climate beginning to stabilize, plants slowly started returning. But this wasn't an overnight recovery. Grasses and small shrubs might appear within a few years, but trees and more complex ecosystems could take decades or even centuries. Early humans had to remain in a state of constant movement, tracking the slow return of life to the land. Coastlines, again, were some of the safest bets. Tidal pools and marine life were less affected by the atmospheric cooling, and the ocean kept producing edible resources no matter how dark the skies had been. But food alone wouldn't ensure survival. Small populations are dangerously fragile. A single bad season or disease outbreak could wipe out entire communities. This is where human adaptability, that mental flexibility we now take for granted, became our most valuable survival trait. Groups had to form tighter social bonds, share resources, and cooperate more than ever before. If one group discovered a safe hunting ground or a patch of edible plants, sharing that knowledge could mean life or death for their neighbors. Over time, these survival strategies began to shape human culture. The archaeological record from this period shows an uptick in innovation, stone tools becoming more specialized, hunting methods more strategic, and, perhaps most importantly, evidence of symbolic thinking. Sites in Africa show pigment use around this time, possibly for body painting or marking objects. While that might sound frivolous when you're one bad hunt away from starving, Symbolic behavior can strengthen group identity and cohesion, a psychological advantage in hard times. There's also the genetic evidence. Modern humans today share remarkable genetic similarity, more than you'd expect from a species with our population size. This supports the bottleneck hypothesis that all of us are descended from a shockingly small number of survivors who made it through Toba's fallout. Whether the global breeding population dropped to a few thousand or something slightly higher is debated, but the pattern is clear. We came dangerously close to blinking out, and yet we didn't. In the centuries following Toba, human populations began to rebound. Warmer periods returned. Hunting grounds flourished again. With fewer humans on the planet, resources per capita actually increased in some areas, giving survivors the opportunity to expand and explore. This may have been a key trigger for later waves of migration out of Africa and into Asia, Europe, and eventually the rest of the world. It's worth pointing out that this recovery wasn't some heroic overnight turnaround. It was slow, uneven, and full of setbacks. Some groups almost certainly failed, wiped out by famine, predators, or bad luck. But others endured, pushing into new territories, testing new survival strategies, and passing on hard-earned knowledge to the next generation. From a distance of 74,000 years, it's tempting to romanticize it, to imagine our ancestors as rugged heroes staring down nature's wrath. The truth was probably less glamorous. They were cold, hungry, scared, and just as confused about the long term as we would be in their place. But they were also resourceful, stubborn, and incredibly adaptable. And those traits are the reason you're here, scrolling through this story instead of being just another extinct primate in the fossil record. So the next time you're stuck in traffic, annoyed at your phone battery, or complaining about the weather, remember, your DNA comes from people who survived a literal, years-long volcanic apocalypse. They endured the worst time in human history, and they still found a way to live, love, and pass on life to the next generation. Because extinction? Yeah, they decided that wasn't on the menu. If you enjoyed this dive into humanity's worst nightmare, stick around, because history's full of other disasters we barely survived.